Thank you, Luke. Yes, thank you. I'm Graham Sheriff, Research Fellow at University of Salford. There's 4 of us presenting today. We're a team that have been working together for a couple of years now, looking at various aspects of cycling and walking, and one of those things is bike share. What we're going to do is talk through some research that we've been involved with and also put that in the context of other research and bigger questions. We're structuring this around an approach called the capability approach, which we'll talk more about shortly. And then we're going to look at some particular issues and then look at future directions. And then we're obviously really pleased that Jimmy's here to talk about the Greater Manchester example, and that's the new plans rather. And that's very much the prompt for this seminar, is this announcement recently about a new bike hire scheme coming to Greater Manchester. And as the headline implies here, there's an opportunity to learn lessons from previous experiences, which was in 2018 when we had Mobike in the city. And during that time, we did a study, which you can see here, which was an online survey and a set of telephone interviews. Excuse me. That was published in 2018, and more recently, we've had a paper published on that in the Journal of Transport Geography, which builds on that research and looks at it in more detail. Both of those are freely available on the website there. So we, they were meant to come up as an animation. Oh well. So we're looking at bike share very much in the context of sustainable transport. We don't believe it's that useful to look at bike share just on its own, because it's very much part of our transport system. So I wanted to highlight those contexts. So one context is obviously cycling, and cycling has, there's a lot of interest in cycling for the environmental and health benefits, and it's become more relevant recently with the government asking people to avoid or limit their use of public transport. It's not desirable for everyone to use a car. It's not even possible for everyone to use a car. For many people, that could be quite excluding the requirement to have a car to participate. So making it easier, making options available for people to cycle is very valuable at the moment, and bike share can play a part in that. And you'll see an image there of a pop-up bike lane in Greater Manchester. And on the top there, you can see an e-scooter that's been in the news quite a lot recently, and there's going to be some trials of those, of the hire schemes in the UK over the coming year. And that's another part of micromobility. So these smaller, sometimes electrically assisted modes of transport that can become part of a wider sustainable transport system. And this government review earlier this year, the Core for Evidence on the Future of Transport Regulation, brings all that together and looks at the opportunities for these newer modes of transport and the potential of them, and what policy and what planning needs to do to accommodate them and get the best out of them. So we see very much bike share to be part of micromobility and in turn part of sustainable transport. And what we want is to understand how better to make bike share part of a sustainable transport system, a system that's sustainable in terms of carbon emissions and also air quality, but also inclusive and enables people to access the things they need, such as work, education, family and social life, because that's the point of the transport system. So our presentation today looks at some of the issues we feel need to be considered to help bike share be part of that sustainable transport system. What are the issues, what are the challenges, and what are the questions for research? So I'd now like to hand over to Mags to talk a bit more about the capabilities approach.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Or am I a disembodied voice? So I am going to talk about the capability approach that we used, and we find that this capabilities approach helped us to describe the different capacities that people have to take up a particular practice, in this case, bike sharing. And the capability approach that we've used in our research was conceived of by Amartya Sen in the 1980s. He's an Indian economist and is concerned about economic and social justice. And the approach focuses on what people are able to do, and Sen calls these functionings. and what shapes those functionings, which Sen calls capabilities. So this part of the presentation will take you through the sort of theoretical underpinning that we used as a framework for analysing and then discussing the findings of our research. So the concept to bear in mind is that capability is the ability to achieve a functioning. And we're interested in the different capacities or powers that people have to take up cycling or to use bike share. And Sen and his colleague Robbins, their concept of conversion factors helps us with this. They help us to describe the bundles of opportunities that are needed to actually do something, and also help us to see why some people have access to those opportunities and others don't. We can use these concepts to describe why different people and groups of people have different resources and opportunities available to them, and the impact this has on their ability to function or to do something. This in turn helps us to know what to focus on when considering issues such as social justice and equality of opportunity, and leads us to understand what barriers need to be addressed to roll out a more equitable bike share scheme or other shared resource scheme. And the conversion factors can be divided into three categories: personal, social, and environmental conversion factors. So, personal conversion factors include protected characteristics such as gender, age, ethnicity, and levels of ability and disability. And they also include skill sets such as ability to read or ability to ride a bike. Social conversion factors include external circumstances which shape a person's world experience. And they include things like inherited wealth or poverty, public policies that may be more or less equitable, social norms within a society or group, and power relations and social hierarchies such as class, wealth distribution, etc. And finally, environmental conversion factors relate to the physical environment in which people live and include the geographical location, climate, pollution, as well as the built environments such as infrastructure, means of transportation and communication. Describing the rollout and use of bike share in relation to these three conversion factors means we can identify the ways in which personal and social contexts can shape the success of a bike share scheme, and the ways in which a scheme can be devised to maximise social justice and equality of provision. So I can provide a quick illustration of the usefulness of conversion factors by describing the factors that shape people's functioning as a cyclist. So for example, individual A in the diagram lives in a typical UK town with relatively little cycling infrastructure. Let's assume that they can afford a bike, but their friends and family don't often cycle, and their confidence cycling in traffic is low. They therefore have a relatively low environmental conversion factor because of the poor infrastructure. But they have a moderately high social conversion factor because they can afford a bicycle and their social circle can cycle, even though they don't often do so. And they have a low personal conversion factor because they lack the confidence and possibly the skill to cycle in traffic. Individual B, on the other hand, lives in a Dutch city with a segregated cycle network and has access to a bike. And whilst they also have little confidence to cycle in traffic, their friends and family cycle for most of their journeys. They therefore have a low personal conversion factor, but their social and environmental context means that their conversion factor whole is higher, and cycling is something that they would consider doing. We have found that many of the well-established barriers to cycling remain relevant in the context of bike share, especially environmental factors, but that bike share creates its own additional challenges. And in the next few slides, we'll take you through the way in which personal and social conversion factors impacted on the uptake of bike share in Greater Manchester in 2018, and the lessons that can be drawn from it in developing the next wave of bike share. So I'm going to hand over to Graham again to talk us through some of those things.
Thank you, Max. Yeah, so in our research, the study I mentioned on bike share in 2018 in Greater Manchester, we did an online survey and a set of interview questions. From that survey, there were a number of things that we wanted to explore, and one of them was the relationship between bike share and cycling more generally. And what our research highlighted and emphasised for us was that bike share helps to reduce some of the barriers to cycling, and this relates to social conversion factors. So if you're wealthy enough, if you have the financial resources and you have the space in your house, then trying out cycling may be relatively easy and affordable. If, on the other hand, you don't have much money available to you and you don't have space at home, then bike share might offer a more affordable way to try cycling, not have to store the bike at home. However, the environmental conversion factor doesn't really change. So this person commenting here, reflects that whether there's a bike available or not, they may still feel unsafe on the roads. So bike share in itself doesn't address that. What was interesting is that unfortunately bike share can make that barrier worse. It can intensify it because some people reflected that when they were riding on bike share bikes, they felt less safe when on their own bike. And that's not a reflection on motorbike as such. There's lots of different bike shares available and they have different kind of quality of bikes, but it's really a lesson that the quality of that bike will really affect how much people use it, and it might affect their whole attitude and experience of cycling generally. It may in fact put them off cycling if they feel that experience has been a bad one. In our sample, we divided our respondents between avoiders, deciders and users. So those people who hadn't used bike share, who might use bike share or were at the time using bike share. And what you can see here is when we asked them what would deter them from using bike share, it's actually some very familiar barriers that we all recognise, I imagine, as the barriers to cycling. Concern about cycling in traffic, being sweaty on arrival, the weather being off-putting, not knowing what routes to take. So those barriers to cycling still exist and they're still very relevant to bike share. And one of the things that we wanted to delve deeper was to understand how this may be experienced differently across society. And one of the things we noticed was that female respondents were much more likely to be deciders than users. So they were warm to the idea of bike share, but for some reason weren't using it. So we wanted to explore whether that meant there were personal conversion factors that meant they were less likely to use bike share. And so we asked people about those barriers, and we noticed that those common barriers, safety, the weather, not knowing routes to take and so on, it was noticeable and significant that females respondents were more likely to give those as reasons for not using bike share. So that's really highlights to us that difference across society of the potential to use bike share. We also noticed that helmet, the lack of ability to have a helmet, or conveniently have a helmet when using bike share, was more of an issue, slightly more of an issue for female respondents. This was an issue across the board, actually. If we look at just where the yellow arrow is there, around 40% of people said that not being able to hire a helmet at the same time as a bike was a deterrent to them using bike share. Now, we're fully aware that there's a massive challenge for bike share providers, and as we've seen in Australia, really of providing helmets, and something that logistically is very challenging. We're also aware there's a big debate around helmets and helmet use, and it's perfectly sensible to say that helmet use is something that's a personal choice and shouldn't be made mandatory. However, this turns that around somewhat and says that actually helmets are an issue. The availability of a helmet is an issue that could deter some people from using bike share. And that's really the question for bike share providers, is what they do with that information. One way of interpreting this, of course, is that this is just one reflection of that kind of perception of danger from cycling. In countries where there's better quality infrastructure that gives people confidence that they can cycle safely, there's much lower helmet usage. So you could argue that this perceived need for a helmet could be much better addressed through providing quality, safe infrastructure for people. Then it's not necessarily the case that helmets have to be provided. However, we wanted to highlight this as something that could be deterring people from using bike share,